Hello, this is Ryan Beasy, and you're listening to the Westminster Standard Podcast, which is the podcast of Jude 3 and the PCA. If you are able to financially support the work of Jude 3, we would sure appreciate it. Would you visit our website, jude3pca.org? Our goal at Jude 3 is to promote the faithful, ordinary, old-school Presbyterian vision of the PCA founders by curating and distributing articles that advance that mission, as well as to produce this podcast with commentary and insight on events in the PCA. And so if you can join with us for a few dollars a month or a one-time gift to aid us in our work, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. We would sure appreciate it. Thank you. Westminster Standard, and I'm Ryan Beasy. Welcome. I'm joined today by the Reverend Darin Stone. Darin, welcome. Thanks for being on the program.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thank you for inviting me, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for your time. I like to begin with, Darin, how did you become a Christian, and how did you come to the Reformed faith?
Yes, so I'm a native Californian, so hopefully that doesn't hold too many people against me off the bat. But I grew up in a family where Christianity was sort of on the outskirts of our life. It was on the periphery of our life, but it was there enough for me to know there was something important about God, Jesus, church, and so forth. But we didn't go to church for most of my upbringing. And it wasn't until I was in the 8th grade, I was invited to a youth group meeting by some friends. And I thought it would be great to spend time with friends in the middle of the week. There were cute girls there, and it was it was just a wonderful opportunity to do that. And I didn't have a negative sensibility towards the church or Christianity at all. It was positive. I had respect for the Lord, but I didn't know the Lord.
Yeah.
And so it was at that youth group. It was just at a broadly evangelical church where I heard the gospel, and it was a sort of altar call. It's not really something that I would do in my own personal ministry, but the Lord used it. And there was just a clear, I heard that God was holy, I am not, and that's a problem, and Jesus is the answer. And the Lord grabbed me then. And from that point onward, I started to grow. I started to read the scriptures. I went home and asked my parents, and I said, when we were really young, when I was, 3, 4, 5, we did go to church, and then we moved. And so I went back and asked them, I said, why don't we go to church anymore? And they didn't really have a good answer for it. So
there is no good answer.
There was no good answer. And so then we just started going to church, and the whole family went. And I mean, it was just a broad evangelical church, a lot of good things about it. And I was able to grow there. And then in terms of coming to the Reformed faith, and this is another oddity, I was involved with Cru. It was called Campus Crusade when I was in college at the University of Arizona, Cru now. And I went on a summer missions project, and most of the staff, the Cru staff, were PCA people. And this was in Atlanta. We were ministering to international students on college campuses like Georgia Tech. And we would have a weekly kind of Atlanta metro gathering, and it was at a PCA church in Atlanta. And during that summer, our entire team read Knowing God by J.I. Packer. And at the time, I thought Max Lucado was the greatest Christian mind that had lived since the Reformation. I mean, I had no idea about anything at that point in time. And I started thumbing through Knowing God, and I had my highlighter in hand. And I mean, the ink ran out by chapter 2. I mean, it was just life transforming. And then providentially, I had a college roommate of mine who was a year older than me, who had graduated and moved and got plugged into a PCA church and was saying, "You should read R.C. Sproul. You should read this. You should read that. Listen to this." And I started to, and I just soaked it up like a sponge. So uh, that's how that all came to pass.
Wonderful. And where are you serving now?
I'm currently the senior minister at Grace Reformed Presbyterian Church in Clayton, North Carolina, which is an ARP church. I spent 17 years in the PCA as teaching elder in the PCA. And so I've just within the past year moved into the ARP. And so our church is in a suburb of Raleigh, a significantly growing area of town. And I'm in heaven. I mean, it's just a wonderful place to be, a true joy to minister to this flock. And so that's where I am now.
Well, yeah, I'm glad, and we're glad you're there, and seeing the Lord use His ordinary means of grace to grow His kingdom. But so for 17 years, you were a PCA minister, now in the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. And how long were you with ministry to state? That's going to be the primary topic of our conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So I was with MTS for a little over 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, tell me a little bit about Ministry to State. I don't know much about it. When was it founded? Where? How did this thing get started?
Right. That's a great question. So Ministry to State, um, the beginnings of it really go back to the Oklahoma City bombing, which occurred in the late 1990s. And Chuck Garriott, a PCA minister, he was ministering at Heritage Presbyterian Church in Oklahoma City. He was in Oklahoma City at the time, and the Oklahoma City bombing happens. Timothy McVeigh, the federal building in Oklahoma City. It was so intense that Chuck he lived several miles away, and he could feel it. I mean, it just reverberated throughout the city. Well, he so happened to have I believe he was like a deputy attorney general of the state of Oklahoma was in his church. And following the bombing, those in state government there were just kind of reeling that this had happened in their city and in a government space. And so this gentleman asked Chuck to just come on down to the Capitol and maybe just lead some prayer and Bible study with he and a few others, 3 or 4 other people. I mean, this is just a small group. This is a totally informal thing, really, with a member of his church. And over the course of several months, it grew into 70 members of the Oklahoma State Senate, State House representatives, executive office members, staff. I mean, it took on a life of its own. Wow. And it became a weekly study, a weekly service of worship and gathering there. And Chuck really was at the time sensing that God was calling him to something else and was looking into to missions overseas. And but then this draw to minister to those in government really grabbed him, and he was seeing so much fruit come from that. And being a native of Baltimore and very familiar with the DC area, Chuck moved in the early 2000s. I want to say 2002-ish, somewhere around those lines, to DC to start ministering to folks in the federal government. And so it has been around in a sense since then. And I believe it came under MTS or under MNA. Ministry of State came under Mission in North America around 2006-ish, somewhere in the mid 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s.
So it had about 10 years as its own organization, and then about 20 years so far it's been a ministry of the Presbyterian Church in America.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's been almost 20 years now that MTS has been part of MNA and a ministry of the PCA.
Okay. So, when I was a kid, I grew up Lutheran, and not the good kind, the bad kind, the ELCA. And so the ELCA had a political outreach arm, and their logo was some sort of bad pun about church state and church state, or church street and state street, or church road and
Sure.
state USA. It's just this awful pun.
Right.
And what their advocacy arm did was, contact members of Congress and the Senate and maybe a little bit on the state level, but largely in DC, and advocate for causes that were endorsed by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Is that what Ministry to State does? Just is it advocacy?
No, it is not advocating for a particular policy.
Oh, okay.
So it doesn't function like that at all.
You're not, or when you were working in Raleigh at the North Carolina State Capitol, you weren't advocating for the PCA has a position on abortion. We would love to see North Carolina adopt positions in light of that.
No, not in any formal sense whatsoever. And really, I mean, just as those topics come up and go in that direction, that it might be discussed, but not. No, the PCA, we never went in. Nobody ever went into a government building and ministered amongst people serving in government as a representative of the PCA's political positions on things, because the PCA doesn't take political positions on.
Could you say that again?
On matters.
What did you? What you just said? What did you say?
Right, because we believe in the doctrine of the spirituality of the church, right? So who knew, right?
So there is no PCA position on a political issue. Is that what you're saying?
We don't take specific political positions on immigration and education, all these different policies that because those who have been called to minister or to serve in public office are called to make those decisions, and they're of course not doing so independent of the Lord. They're not doing so outside of the kingship of Christ, because Christ rules over all things. They're accountable to the Lord. However, whether they recognize that or not. However, the PCA as a denomination, as a church, does not go in and say, this is what you ought to be doing policy-wise here, 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 and here, because that's not the calling of the church. So we go into the government space, to the capitals or wherever else it might be, and simply seek to be ministers and missionaries to those who serve in government, just as an RUF campus minister would do on the college campus, or a military chaplain would do in the military, or as prison chaplains do, and so forth. So we
have a large number in our presbytery and in our congregation who are ministering in the prisons through Metanoia, another outreach of Mission to North America. There are 4 or 5 different ways that MNA is working, and so Metanoia is one of those. Ministry to State is another one of those. So your mission, and as is on the screen there, is not political advocacy any more than it would be political advocacy on the college campus or in the prison.
Exactly.
What you did was discipleship and outreach. Am I understanding correctly?
Right. Yes. I mean, we would develop relationships with people, seek to meet with them, seek to bring the word of God to bear upon them, seek to pray with them, seek to sort through issues that they were dealing with as an individual. Because, I mean, these are government officials, right? I mean, these are public figures, but they're also people who put on their shoes and socks the same way you and I do every day. I mean, they're ordinary people. They have families.
Don't they have people to do that for them, though, to put on their shoes for them? And
once and that's one of the joys of being a state capitol minister instead of in Washington, D.C. Because, state politics is kind of like the AA baseball of politics, right? I mean, they're professionals. They're high and mighty people in some respects, but it's certainly not on the profile folks in D.C. have.
Yeah, I remember when I was in Mississippi. We'd be at the Pizza Inn, and there's Lydia Chastinol, our state senator, and there's Carl Oliver, the other state senator, and it was just these are the people that he got the last of the Hawaiian pizza, and I guess I'm gonna have to wait.
Exactly. I ran into, when I was living in Jackson, I went to RTS Jackson too, like you, and I ran into Trent Lott in a Red Robin or something like that in Mississippi. So I hear you.
Yes. So these are people that need ministry just as you and I do. So what makes Ministry to State unique then? Are there other denominations within NAPARC that are doing this sort of ministry, or even within more broadly evangelical Christianity?
There is no denomination that I know of at all that's, I mean, within NAPARC or outside of it, that sends an ordained minister into the state capitol uh, as an outreach of the church itself, to minister to those who serve in government.
Wow, that is
So
really remarkable.
so the PCA has something unique for as long as it has it. I mean, I don't know if you've heard that M&A has decided to separate from MTS and move MTS into it's kind of in a no man's land right now, but potentially becoming parachurch because of the mission that M&A has determined to have, which is really disappointing in my view of things, because this has been a vital ministry of the PCA for a number of years, and is really in the past 5 or 6 years become much more known and has expanded profoundly. And so the decision to separate is something I don't fully understand and agree with. However, that's what's been determined to do. So I don't know what ministry to state status is going to be with regard to any official relationship with the PCA going forward. That's not something that I don't know the answers to those questions, but I do know that that's what's happening. So it's likely that it will become a parachurch ministry of some sort for at least the time being.
Well, I don't remember us voting on that at the General Assembly in Richmond this year, so I would assume that'll be after this coming General Assembly in Chattanooga. Yeah, I think it's
Well,
you'd think I would know, since I think it is
Chattanooga. Get them all mixed up every year. See, now that's the thing about the ARP. Now I'm in the ARP, which I didn't. I'll say this on a personal note: I didn't leave the PCA out of any axe to grind with the PCA. It's purely for the church. I love the PCA with all my heart. I mean, my relationships are there, and I don't have any. I wasn't looking to depart from the PCA, but I don't know that this is a decision that the General Assembly will be making. I mean, this was a decision made by the executive leadership team of M&A, and the permanent committee, I believe, voted on that. But that's what has happened. So to my knowledge, this isn't something that's going to be coming before the General Assembly for a vote. And ministry to state was one of about 4 or 5 other ministries that they separated from. So we're not the only one. It's just that there were, in terms of whatever they were doing in terms of restructuring, that was the decision that was made.
Well, you kind of dropped a bomb on me there, Darin. You recently left the PCA, so you know that the last couple of General Assemblies have been sort of the polity and procedure assemblies, where our permanent committees have been reminded that they are committees,
right?
Not commissions.
Yes.
I remember one agency coordinator standing up in St. Louis saying, "We don't need the General Assembly telling us about polity," and then the venerable David Coffin getting up there and saying, "No, it is the General Assembly that sets," I'm paraphrasing, of course.
Right, of course.
Sets the policy for our committees. And then the last couple of years dealing with Reformed University Ministries and the affiliation agreement, that no, it is the General Assembly that must approve these affiliation agreements. So I have many questions, but
that's your battle to fight now, right?
Well, we're going to pick those carefully, but that is interesting that you mentioned that. I'll maybe we'll have some more information for our listeners if this ever comes out, if my incompetent production team can even get this out. But so sorry. Going back to what
sidebar.
Sorry about that. But Ministry to State, as of now, as of this recording, is unique in that it is, from what I heard you say, the only denominationally affiliated, ordained ministry to government officials and employees. Whereas Reformed University Fellowship is one of a dozen big campus ministry. There's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Crew. You mentioned there's outreach, CO that I think Birmingham has started. But so what you're saying is that ministry to state is unique among it really has no peers in that it is the outreach, not advocacy, but outreach of a church to government on the state and national level.
Right. And there are parachurch organizations that
Sure.
minister in political environments. So it is a little bit like RUF in the sense that RUF is sending an ordained teaching elder onto the university campus alongside other campus ministries where they have campus staff that are not ordained by a church or denomination. So there is some similarity there. But this is I would say quite unique that we send someone who's gone through seminary, who's passed ordination exams, who has a call from the church to minister in this environment and the call to be a minister of word and sacrament, to do so at the amongst those serving in government. That is a unique place that the PCA has.
But they're not, just to be clear, they are ministers of word and sacrament, but they're not, serving the sacraments on the Capitol grounds, right?
No, of course not.
Okay,
of course
just
not. No. Right? No, just
don't hear what we're not saying.
Don't hear what I'm not saying.
That's right. That's an important that there are Christian things to do. I recorded an episode recently with Miles Smith, and he was helping me to think through the difference between something that is churchly versus something that is simply Christian.
Sure.
And that's an important distinction. So you are doing, you're not doing the word and sacrament, or you're doing the word, obviously, but not the sacraments there. So this is not then something that any other parachurch organization is doing. Just like, I think you're right, Reformed University Fellowship is unique in that it is an ordained minister, whereas InterVarsity or one of these others wouldn't have an ordained man serving in that capacity. And I think that speaks to the way the Presbyterian Church in America values ordained office and the importance of word and sacrament ministry.
Right, absolutely.
So then, let me ask you this: elected officials and government employees, they have their own churches, I assume. Some of them at least. So how does that relate? When you were serving at the North Carolina State Capitol, would you primarily work with PCA senators and representatives, or would you? How did that? Walk me through a day in the life of Darin Stone, minister to state in Raleigh.
Good question. Well, there are those in the Capitol, in public office, who make a profession of faith. They claim to follow Christ. There's those that certainly do. I mean, I don't question their salvation more than others who I greatly respect and look up to in the faith. But when they are in Raleigh, they're away from their districts, right? So they could be 200 miles away from their home district. And what we're really doing is providing pastoral care to those believers in government while they're away from their homes, away from their families, their day jobs. And by the way, in North Carolina, they do have day jobs. Because state representatives and senators in North Carolina only get paid about $14,000 a year. So you're not going to make your bread and butter off of that. You either are retired or you have a business that you have someone else managing your business, or you're still involved. I mean, I know people who are involved in the day-to-day operations of their whatever vocation that they have, and they're doing this $14,000 a year elected side gig that is not. I mean, it's part-time, but it's not part-time. I mean, it's all the time.
You're getting phone calls all year.
All year long.
When the assembly's not in session, I'm sure.
Sure, right. So, I mean, they're in Raleigh and away from all of that, and it's an opportunity to go into the actual space where they work and where they're conducting their day-to-day life, and be able to impart the word to them and to listen to them and to counsel them and disciple them and to pray with and for them. And so that is much the way in which the church is seeking to, the church, the PCA, is seeking to to see the government space as a mission field, as a place to reach those who've yet to come to know Christ, but also to disciple those who do know the Lord, and in the place where they work while they're away from their churches and away from their homes.
And so, how would you go about building these relationships? You get there, and you're trying to get a meeting, and the chief of staff or secretary of Senator Smith says, "Well, do you live in District 14?" Well, no. How do you get a meeting with the state senator for District 14, or however they do it in North Carolina?
Right. I mean, that's an outstanding question, because when I first started the ministry, I mean, I felt like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with no bread.
Oh,
I mean, like, what do I do with this? Because
so you were the first. You were the first guy to do this in North Carolina.
In North Carolina, I was.
Yeah.
Now,
wow.
Thankfully, there had been ministry that had been established in D.C., and there were a few others ministering in state capitals, and our team, we got together routinely over Zoom and talked about ministry strategy and what's working in your state, and how to do this. And Chuck Garriott he hung the moon as far as I'm concerned. He's just a salt of the earth guy, and really is, you think of someone who's the executive director and founder of a ministry to those in government, you're going to think that this guy is, locked into every political issue on the face of the earth. And honestly, Chuck is not. We just didn't talk politics as we got together, unless it was something that was explicitly pertaining to some ministry issue we were dealing with. So we would be able to help each other think through what worked in different places. But in order to answer your question in a more succinct way, when I was raising the financial support for this ministry, I'd go to various PCA churches and ARP churches and Reformed churches, different NAPARC churches, not just within the PCA, but NAPARC,
really?
to raise support for this ministry, but also to raise awareness that, hey, there's an actual ministry at the Capitol who's seeking to disciple and evangelize those in government. And whether I went to a church of 50 people or 2,000 people, it seemed like there was always someone in the church who had some relationship with someone in state government, whether it was their state senator or representative or a judge or a policy advisor or something of that nature. And they would make a soft connection for me. And so that was one thing that one way I got to know people. Another way that I got to know people was by just looking them up and praying for them. I mean, I would look up their campaign sites and their political websites and so forth. I'd follow them on social media, so I could determine that way whether someone either professed to be a Christian or had at least some Christian sensibilities, where you understand what I'm saying by that. They may not actually be a believer, but they would view an outreach from a minister. They would take that positively. They would likely take that positively. So there's that, and then even those who clearly make no profession of faith whatsoever, I would look to see, is there any area of my life and this person's life that sort of connect, where we would have something in common, because we may not agree on, anything on the face of the earth. We may not have a point of agreement, but for instance, there's one person in the State House representative who's a lesbian, married to another woman. But I followed her she was appointed, she filled a spot for someone else and then was reelected. And so I followed her on social media, and I saw an interview that she did with some political action committee, and learned there that she and her wife have 2 children who are the same age as my 2 youngest children. So she loves her children. I love my children. We're in the same stage of life in terms of raising children, even though things look so different. Um, and I just went to her. I just walked by her office, saw her door open. She was in there. Her legislative aide was not, and I just introduced myself, told her what I was, told her what I did, and shared with her that I saw her interview, and it was nothing particularly outrageous, that
Yeah.
particular interview. So I just told her I appreciated hearing what she was interested in doing this term, and also said, I also learned that you have a couple of kids same age as mine, so you must be juggling a lot. And from there on, it was just that's all that it was.
Yeah.
And from there on out, I saw her all the time. We would chit chat a little bit, and I know she has some kind of Catholic background, so she has some categories that she might have somewhere in there. And you never know what the Lord will do with that over the course of the long haul.
All right. So, as you said earlier, these are people who put on their socks one sock at a time,
Mm-hmm.
and so you just build a relationship where you can find connection, as
Right.
any minister of Word and Sacrament would do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Um, so you see it then as fulfilling an important kingdom role and opportunity. I mean, you did it for 5 years, so you clearly saw this
Sure. Yeah, and I
as
wasn't even looking to leave the ministry there. I mean, the lines fell for me to end up at this church that I'm at here in the Raleigh area, and I'm thrilled for that. And I do grieve a little bit leaving MTS, but it is a vital ministry that I want to see thrive in different, and I'll say this too, Ryan. I mean, there's different fronts of MTS. So there's the state capitol front, there's the federal government front in Washington D.C., and then there's also the the plan to extend out into international
oh
capitals.
wow.
So we've been working with some PCA churches. I know in the past, and I don't know all that's going on there now, but just trying to make some connections in Ottawa, in Canada. I know there's been some work in the Bahamas and even overseas in Europe and African countries. I believe there's been some work there. And then you'll notice right there, you're highlighting Carlos and Corey Demas. They're working with embassies in Washington D.C. So foreign embassies, reaching people who work in those capacities as well. Carlos and Corey are Spanish is their first language, and so there's just a smooth kind of a smooth transition for them to be able to minister well in that capacity.
So walk me through, here on the website is the mission of ministry to state, and I think it's such an important. Even the name is so important. It's not advocacy to state.
Mm-hmm.
This is serving the state, which I suppose could get people's hair on the back of their necks. But they do need to be served, even if they are in government. So, what is that mission, the vision for ministry to state that you had when you were doing the work in North Carolina, or that might still be ongoing in one of these other state capitals,
Mm-hmm.
as you see it?
Right. I mean, my big 35,000 foot perspective as I would minister in the capital was I am a minister and a missionary. So I'm seeking to reach lost people with the gospel and seeking to disciple people who make a profession of faith with the gospel. So that's really what you're going to see there with mission that you have pulled up on the screen there. Gospel, exposing those in the government community to the transforming truths of the gospel through healthy relationships. So just developing those relationships, having a ministry of presence around. People in politics tend to be somewhat outgoing and talkers. You kind of have to be in order to be in that capacity. So they talk to people, and again, in the AA baseball world of state politics, it's not as difficult as you would think it is to connect with state people elected to state house and state senate on the state level. Now, of course, executive offices and the judiciary are a little bit trickier, but
so it might be AAA or 4A baseball. Is that what you're saying?
Right, exactly. But the lower hanging fruit is going to be the legislative branch. So we would seek to bring the gospel to them, and as you develop those relationships with people and begin to have that capital, no pun intended, but that relational capital that you have with people, you learn where they stand on things. You learn what they believe about God, about the Lord Jesus, about people, about the world, and so that's where you can disciple them towards a distinctively biblical, Christ-like worldview, and help shape their conscience as well, as far as that's concerned.
Yeah. I remember when I was in Mississippi again. Our state senator, one time there was a knock on my study door, and she came in and she said, Ryan, they gave me this this video series as a state senator, but would you watch it and see if there's anything objectionable in it? And if there's not, I want to give it to the public library. But and that was her being proactive. And actually, she wasn't even my state senator. We lived 100 yards from each other, but the way the line was drawn,
we were on right.
We were in a different.
You were on the wrong side of the sidewalk. It cut off.
Really, really, yeah. She would say, "Oh yeah, your kids to come fishing in our pond and all." She was just a lovely person, even though she didn't technically. I couldn't vote for her, legally at least. Right. But just to have that kind of relationship with a proactive state senator, whereas you can be proactive in the local area where they might look. I've got these resources that were given to me. I might want to give them to my library. Would you look at them? And of course, now libraries are on the front lines of the culture war after being sort of forgotten for a generation.
Exactly.
To be able to have a PCA minister that has that ministry of presence and access and relationship with numerous legislators.
Yes, and the ministry of presence point that I made is just absolutely vital. Just being there, just having a presence. Yeah. I would wear, so I'm wearing a sport coat. I would dress appropriately, right? Wear a suit to the Capitol. But I had a little PCA lapel pin, right? So it's got a cross on it. It's the
open Bible, yeah.
The PCA logo, whatever you think of that. But it's got something.
Out of the Hut. No, it's a Mandalorian.
So whatever it is,
going to have to set me straight.
And so at any rate, people would see that and. They would ask questions. I mean, they're inquisitive people. Yeah. And so just wearing that gave me an opportunity to talk about the things of Christ and learn about people so I could minister to them well. And then you're seeing on here, and I'm going to touch on church in a minute, but prayer there. Going into any ministry and anything that you do in life prayerfully is just absolutely vital, and I don't need to go into all the reasons why. That's obvious. Yeah. But you go into to the Capitol, and I'm just praying that the Lord will, in His grace and His providence, lead me to the right people at the right time and the right. Give me some margin to talk to them, because these are busy people. People are pulling on their legs all the time. They've got lobbyists. I mean, they can't walk from here to their office door without someone trying to bug them about something. So to get a few minutes with them, to get 5 minutes in a hallway with someone is a win. And of course, you can set appointments and get together for longer periods of time, but in those informal ways, just asking the Lord to provide ways for you to make those connections. And He blessed that in ways that I could have never imagined how He would do. So I'm just grateful for that. But the prayerfulness is so vital in that ministry, because if you have that ministry of presence and you're there, and then you're asking the Lord to provide opportunities to make use of that presence, then He shockingly has a way of doing that. So,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So how would you say the spiritual mission of the PCA then was enhanced by ministry to state, in your own experience, or speaking generally about this as an organization, part of the PCA?
Well, because Ministry to States ministry has a spiritual mission. Its mission is to bring the word of God to bear upon those who serve in government, to to bring the gospel to them, to bring Christ to them, to point them towards the person and work of the Lord Jesus Christ, to help Christians walk in newness of life. I mean, that's just what we're doing in the church, right? That's what pastors do. That's what. It's not the same thing as church ministry, because it's not a local church, but it is a spiritual mission that we're after, as opposed to a political mission. Now, there are spiritual issues are involved in political issues, like they're involved in everything, of course, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, it is not at all the PCA's political advocacy arm. It's not the PCA's PAC, or anything of the sort. It's simply just what we do in other arenas to bring the gospel to certain demographics of people. So that's why I think the spiritual mission of the church is enhanced. And also, so there's an angle of ministry to state where the minister has a ministry into the government, but there's also a leverage that an MTS minister has back into the church, to where he can help local churches pray intelligently for their elected leaders, to equip them to think about what it looks like to be a political citizen of a state and a nation, while ultimately keeping in mind that our citizenship is in heaven. I mean, there's a lot of bad teaching out there pertaining to what the Christian faith looks like as it engages in politics. And we've seen all sorts of erroneous ways in which that's manifested itself, on the left-hand side of things, on the right-hand side of things, in some no man's land of things. And I think that as we have the Reformed faith has tremendous resources in terms of helping the church think through these things and to be able to speak into them. And I think it's particularly helpful for local churches to invite MTS ministers into that, because it can, depending upon the nature of your congregation. I mean, you know how it is when people start talking about politics. I mean, you talk about the hair on their neck. I mean, people lose their minds. I mean, they just go into complete wacko mode, and they hear what you're not saying a lot of times too. And it's easier for someone, I guess, from the outside to sometimes come in and speak to those things than it is for maybe the minister of the church, or one of the ministers of the church, or the elders of the church, to speak to those things. Now, I think that they should be discipling their people as to how to be Christ-like citizens, political citizens, just like they do to disciple them how to be husbands and wives and parents and all the other things.
Yeah.
However, just because of the nature of the topic, I think it does, it's a benefit. It's just a resource to the church to have an MTS minister to be able to come in and do that. So I had the opportunity to go in and teach a 4-week-long Sunday school class somewhere, a 6-week-long class at such and such church, to preach on Romans 13 or passages that pertain to these issues. And I think that was helpful for the church.
Yes. And it's always helpful to the minister to have someone from the outside come in and preach those difficult or touchy topics, because they receive it.
Yeah.
Sometimes they receive it better. And if they don't, then they're not mad at the preacher or the pastor. They're mad at the preacher, not the pastor.
You just say, don't let that guy back in here again.
That's right. Okay. Well, he won't be back in. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And we've done that on occasion, that he will not be back.
Right.
Yes. So you've touched on this as how churches can partner or should partner or might, not as if there's a moral imperative, but the benefits to the church to partner with one of these ministry to state uh, pastors,
Mm-hmm.
if there's one in their area. And I see it's not just ordained men, but there are opportunities for unordained people to serve as
Mm-hmm.
well as with many of our agencies. Our UF has that as well. I'm
Right.
sure some of the others, that seems to be the most well-known parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but is there any other, you think about our Christian duty? Now I understand that on November 5th there is something happening nationally, and would this be a situation where people who are ministering in the halls of government, not as government ministers, deacons, but as ministers of word and sacrament in the halls of government, that you could speak into and encourage the people for ways that they might pray more intelligently for their elected officials and those who are employed by the government?
Right. I mean, broadly speaking, the scripture calls us to pray for those who have authority, that we might, live peaceful, quiet lives, godly and dignified in every way.
I've read that
So
in a book somewhere.
it's in the book somewhere. so we pray that. I mean, that's broad, right? You pray that these men and women who serve in either elected office or even serve in, they're appointed to particular positions where they have certain levels of power to make important decisions for us, that they will make decisions that help the flourishing of the church and promote um, righteousness and godliness. I mean, you read in the Proverbs that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. So
Mm.
we want to see uh, nefarious policies, whatever the case may be, uh, pushed against, and somehow uh, never come to fruition,
Yeah.
and policies that help the peace and purity of the church and the flourishing of the gospel in our nation and to the ends of the earth come to pass, whatever those may be. And in the providence of God, I mean, you never know what He's doing, but you just pray for that, right? You pray for what we're instructed to pray for, and that the church would be a faithful witness to Christ in the midst of a world that seems to be, feels like it's out of control, but we know it's not.
Mm.
And in the midst of a world where there's just people don't know how to talk about these matters in a sane, godly way, right?
Mm.
So you pray to that end, and pray that the Lord would you know hinder evil from flourishing, and promote that which is good. I mean, these are basic things that you just pray for, but we're called to pray for these people. And I think that when you look even at the history of Reformed theology, the Puritans, Presbyterianism, and so forth, people had a strong sense of their national identity. They were. I mean, I'm rereading through Precious Remedies against Satan's Devices right now, and Thomas Brooks even addresses England in there. I mean, it's hard to imagine a contemporary author addressing just America in a book that isn't explicitly speaking of our civic relationships. So. We need to think in those terms, that God would do a work in the church in America, so that we not so that we would make America great again, not so that our political agendas would all come to pass, but so that the light and salt of the gospel would go forth, and that people would be able to grow in the grace and knowledge of Him.
Mm, yes, and that seems to have been something that's been lost, at least since the middle of the 19th century. That Christians understood that they were political,
Right.
even that Christians should be involved in and running these institutions of the state as Christians, and doing so in a way that was godly and dignified. Whereas now we have this strange bifurcation, as though we are always worshiping, but that does not mean that we are not political creatures. That in the garden, even there was a political society. That's the family, and then very sadly, relatively quickly, the civil magistrate was ordained in
Mhm.
Genesis 9. Um,
Right.
so we have to think about seeking the welfare of the city or the state.
Yeah.
And one of the ways we do that is by praying. One of the ways that we do that is by
Mhm.
building those relationships with government officials and employees.
Right.
Well, you've mentioned some already, but one of the things I like to hear is just some encouraging stories about your ministry during your time with ministry to state. Where did you see exceptionally clear instances of God's providence working? I know you mentioned praying for these opportunities, and then these opportunities presenting themselves in ways that maybe
Correct.
you weren't ready for, and yet there was the open door for ministry there, literally
Right.
sometimes.
So, I mean, gosh, I have so many. I mean, I'll share a couple.
Please,
One, and these are both with people if I lived in their district, I don't know that I would vote for them, because of some different views on political matters. However, the first it was the first day of the new legislative year, and I was standing in the legislative building by myself. There's lots of people moving around, and this gentleman comes up to me and says, "Can you tell me where the state house chamber is?" And I said, "Well, let me just take you there, because I mean, it's going to be amazing. I'm going to have to tell you to turn left and right 15 times." So we got to talking, and I discovered that he he was newly appointed to the House because his predecessor was appointed to a judicial uh, position. So he was
full
appointed,
time work, huh?
but he had never been to to the state house, and so
Oh
he's
my!
supposed to go have a seat in the chamber in 15 minutes, and he doesn't even know where it is. So we get to talking, and learn a little bit about him on the way over there,
Yeah.
over and that started a relationship that has just been a beautiful one. And I've been able to talk to him about the things of Christ, and to be able to sit with him over coffee, and point him to Jesus, and pray with and for him, and
Mm.
learn about his life, learn about the struggles that this person has, and so forth. And I mean, what a joy to be able to invest in a person's life that way, where God just literally brought this guy to me. I wasn't seeking him out. I didn't know him from anybody. He didn't know me, and I didn't know him. So it was just a great thing. And then, kind of like the story I shared with you earlier about the woman who has the two children that same ages as mine. But then there are believers too. So
Mm.
I was connected I mean, I guess I could think of several off the top of my head, people who are followers of Christ, who I just made appointments with, and then we just developed that relationship over time. They would be walking, they'd be walking through the state legislative building, and they would see me, and then even come over to me and say, "Can you pray for my son? Can you pray for my wife who's having surgery? Can you? I am so overwhelmed with what I have to do here, and I'm so overwhelmed with what I need to do with my company back in such and such a place, and I just had a grandchild, and and all this all at the same time, and I'm trying to be a faithful believer, and there's temptations, and to cave in on the issues of who I am in Christ. And I need you to pray for me for those things." And I could do that for them right there. And so those stories are innumerable, and it was just a joy to be able to be part of people's lives like that.
Mm.
So
That is,
so they're talking to me, and we're not dissecting the latest policy thing. We're talking as people, individuals, who who both need the Lord.
mm,
So
yes. Wow. Uh, well, I know you mentioned some possible news, but that notwithstanding that, what what do you see about the ministries of state in the future? You mentioned possible expansion to foreign governments,
Mhm.
which would be well, it'd be remarkably different and more open in some ways, perhaps, and less in others because of
Right.
the unique American
Mhm.
experiment as
Mhm.
far as religion and the government.
Mhm.
But what do you see for ways that MTS might serve the PCA and Christ ultimately in the future?
Right. Well, I think that what I've said about international capitals is really what I know. I know that there's endeavors to expand that ministry. I don't know the details of it. But on the state capital level, I think that's really where uh, PCA churches can be intentional about seeking to bring this ministry to pass in their own
Mm.
state. I mean, you really need to think about it as this is a statewide ministry. So the ministry takes place largely at the state capital, wherever the state capital is in your state. But the people who work there represent districts all throughout the state. So whether or not you're a church in the state capital is not quite as important. But if you are a PCA church in a state capital, I would really encourage those churches to pray about, think about, strategize about, and work with MTS about seeking to develop a ministry in that state,
Mm.
because it's a kingdom issue. Is your church going to grow by 50 people because of this? Probably not. But it's a it's a mission field, and churches are strategically located there, and the church itself can have some kind of mission into the political arena through the MTS state capital ministry that's happening there. So I think that they should be praying about it and seeking to work with MTS to bring on someone to pony up the funds to help support this. And I think that seeing this ministry take off in capitals all across our country really would be a joy to see come to pass.
Yes, yes.
Right.
It was interesting to me which capitals they have personnel in. I mean, Montana. Who would have thought?
Right. I know.
Probably are 4 PCA churches in all of Montana. I'm sure
Right.
I'll hear back if I got that number wrong. But it's also something people may not consider how easy it is to get access even to a state capital. I remember going in Ohio and in South Carolina. We were visiting those cities, Columbus and Columbia, and we just walked on to the Capitol grounds. Now this was before, before how things are now, whatever that means. It seems to be what
Right.
everybody says, whatever the thing now is. But and at the Ohio State Capitol, the docent or whoever made the point, you probably noticed it was easier to get access to the Capitol building here in Columbus than your local county courthouse, and that's by design. That in our state constitution, or it is mandated, or it's our principle of the government in Ohio that we want access for the people.
Right.
And likewise, when I was touring in the Columbia at the state capitol in Columbia, South Carolina, we just joined a tour. There was some school group, and their local state rep was giving them a tour of the Capitol, and they said, "Well, we're visiting from wherever we were visiting from, and just wanted to see." And he said, "Oh yeah, well, come on!" And this was 20 something. Ooh, it was longer than 25 years ago, but
Right. Sure. Yeah. Just join
but
in.
that's the attitude and access that Christians can have. And
Mhm.
I think Christians, we get, the thing that is happening on November 5th kind of sucks so much of our attention and our anxiety that we forget that a lot of the politics that matter most, a lot of the ways that we can seek the welfare of the city of our exile is in Atlanta, or is in Ringgold, the county seat, and the state capital. That is going to have much more impact than who's elected in November.
Exponentially so. Exponentially so. I mean, who your state representatives and senators and city council people are, those matter tremendously, and they really what you see and experience on a day-to-day basis is largely the product of what's happening on the state and local level. You feel that more poignantly than what even happens on the federal level, even though the federal is what gets all the media attention.
Yes, yes, and that that's not to make a political statement one way or the other, but just
Right.
reality that one of the ways that you can love your neighbor. And I know some Christians believe it's just pointless to vote, and I'm not saying you must vote, but we do have a duty to seek the welfare of this city, and one of the ways that we can do that is by bringing the gospel to governmental leaders,
Exactly.
and that I think is something that everyone could agree on. Well,
Right.
Darin Stone, anything else as we close?
No, nothing else other than just it's been a joy to be on here. And if you are listening and your state does not have a state capital ministry, and you can find out if it does by going to ministrytostate.org. But if your state does not have a state capital ministry, pray about it, talk to your pastors about it, talk to your presbyteries about it, reach out to Ministry to State about it, and see what maybe the Lord might be doing in your state to bring such a ministry to pass.
Yes, indeed. Well, thanks for your time. And you can find Darin Stone. You have your own podcast with George Sayor, I think. It's called Grace to Stand. Is that right?
That's right.
And do you have? I know George has multiple podcasts. Do you have multiple podcasts as well, or is...
No, I just have the one. I don't.
Okay, well,
just that one, and it's a treat to be on there. So check us out.
yeah. Please do. Yes, I enjoy and you and George will usually have, it's about a half-hour conversation talking about something timely, and I appreciate your ministry there. So, Darin Stone, thank you for joining the program.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan.
Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. For more information or to make a donation to support our work, visit our website, jude3pca.org. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time for a conversation with Sean Morris and T. David Gordon regarding ethics and ways the PCA can make better choices together. I'll talk to you then.